It's late at night and all over my feed, reports of the Iranian airspace shutting start to surface. The Pentagon is ready and pilots are in flight. An imminent US attack on the Islamic regime is about to happen. All over the world, people are holding their breath, and then, in the last minute, Trump cancels it. No attack, no intervention. Iran reopens its airspace, and a press release is given by Trump, who announces that the Islamic regime has stopped all the murders and executions, and so the intervention is unnecessary. Well, that's the official excuse. But the real story is very different. It's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE that have asked him to stop the attack. It's not just an ask. They actively deny access to their airspace, and in Qatar's case, forbid them from using their US base on Qatar soil to launch the attack. Why are the nations that have feared Iran for decades now acting as its primary shield against American intervention? In the Middle East, there are always many more layers to a story that are often untold, which is exactly what we are going to do today. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves. To truly understand this, we need to start at the beginning. This is the Meira K show on JNS TV. Let's do it. So we're going to start back in 1971. The US is in trouble. It's losing the Vietnam War and it's really broke. And they are still locked in a Cold War against Russia. To make matters worse, the British Empire has just packed up and left the Gulf of Iran, leaving the world's leading oil supply unmanned. This creates a massive power vacuum that the Americans are terrified the Soviets are gonna fill. Iran's location controls the energy flow to Europe and Asia, as we have previously discussed, and if Russia takes control of that, it's catastrophic for the West. Someone needs to oversee it. But since the US can't afford to deploy 100,000 troops, they come up with a twin pillars strategy. And here's the deal that they struck. It's a division of labor. Pillar number one is with Iran. They're the muscle. Washington is looking at the Shah of Iran and sees a secular, ambitious leader who wants to recreate the Persian Empire. So they sold him their most advanced weaponry, tanks, destroyers, and most famously the F-14, which was the most sophisticated fighter jet on Earth, and the only country allowed to fly them, besides the US, is now Iran. In return, the Shah's job is to patrol the waters, keep the shipping lanes open, and make sure the Soviets don't get any ideas. Pillar number two of this twin pillar strategy is Saudi Arabia. They are the bank. They don't have the population to field a massive army like Iran, but they have something else: spiritual legitimacy. They can fight against communist ideals with their religion, stopping it from spreading across the Arab nations. But more importantly, they have unlimited cash. Their job is to keep the Arab world anti-communist and stabilize the oil markets. In the 1970s, almost every oil country, like Iran, have huge populations to feed. So they're pumping every drop of oil they can just to pay their bills. They have zero flexibility. Saudi Arabia, however, is different. Because they have a tiny population and massive reserves, they can afford to lead millions of barrels in the ground, and this gives them the spare capacity. If Iran tries to blackmail the US by raising prices, let's say, Saudi Arabia can just turn on a valve, flood the market with their spare oil, and crash the price. Effectively, they are the ones who control the price of oil. It's important to note that their king, too, is forward-thinking. He's no friend to Israel, but he sees the Russians as the ultimate threat to Islam, and he realizes that the US are good allies for him to have, so they can offer him solutions to real issues he is facing in Saudi Arabia. In 1974, they formalized this. The US Treasury secretly fly to Riyadh to close what is now known as the petrodollar agreement. It's pure genius in its simplicity, but it's also something that drastically impacts the world till this day, and most people don't even know about it. The terms are pretty straightforward. The US agreed to provide absolute military security to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and, crucially, to use the US Army of Engineers to modernize the countries, building their military bases, ports, and universities, and transforming them from a desert to a superpower. Remember, this is a time when Arab monarchies are falling like flies. You've got Egypt, etc., and the Saudis want protection against that. In exchange for this protection, the Saudis agreed to price all oil sales in US dollars and to invest their surplus profits back into the US Treasury bonds. So, what does that mean for those of us who are not obsessed with economics? The Saudis, having the most surplus of oil, set the rules of the game. And by pricing the oil in dollars, they effectively force every country in the world that wants to buy oil to need to do so in dollars. This suddenly makes the dollar high in demand, which in turn stabilizes the US economy. This is true till this day. You know how you might live in a different country, but you still know how much the dollar is worth? This is due to the petrodollar system. Every country has to own dollars to be able to interact with the oil market. And then in turn, because they have dollars, they also use it for other things to fuel their economy. The Saudis, in return for the tech and protection, gave the US back its economic stronghold. They also invested all of the extra cash they had in the US, giving the US room to grow and develop because it was a lot of cash. Interestingly enough, because the US supported Israel, the Saudis didn't want to be seen as Zionists. So this is all done in complete secret, with the US building out secret entities just for them that weren't traceable in the same way. Whatever. That's a story for another time. It's starting to make sense now why the relationships with the Saudis is much more crucial than we have all been led to believe. But I am getting ahead of myself. Because with the US economy stabilized, the Saudis are strong, and Iran's military abilities are growing, it seems like all is well. Until 1979, the year that everything falls apart, like we've discussed in our previous episode. The muscle, the Shah of Iran, collapses. The US watches in horror as their strongest ally in the region, who was overseeing the oil, is now overthrown. Not by a Soviet army, but by a religious revolution led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, our best friend. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we have to be a little bit honest. This was largely due to a terrible miscalculation by the United States. By the late 70s, Washington was actually becoming a little bit sick of the Shah. He was becoming arrogant and hiking up oil prices to fund his own ego and ignoring American advice, so the Carter administration made a fatal gamble. They looked at the opposition and thought, maybe we can work with these new guys. Maybe getting rid of the Shah is not the worst thing, and they were insanely wrong. They didn't get a better partner. They got a regime that took 52 American diplomats hostage and declared the US the Great Satan, and we know the rest of that story. Now, remember all of the tech we had gifted Iran in return for protection against the Soviets? This is now in the hands of the crazy Ayatollah. The billions of dollars of top-tier American technology we had poured into Iran are now in the hands of an enemy. So the Shah falls, and suddenly Washington and Saudi Arabia are staring at the same nightmare scenario. They weren't just afraid of Iran being mean to its population. They're afraid of two very specific things that are threatening the Western world order. Number one, the new Iranian regime wasn't just a government, it's a cause. As we've discussed, Ayatollah Khomeini openly declares that the monarchy is anti-Islamic. By him taking over Iran and deposing the king, the Shah, he's broadcasting a message to the people of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain who are very religious. Your kings are corrupt American puppets. Rise up and overthrow them like we did. The Saudis are terrified. They saw Iran as a virus that could infect their own population and dissolve their borders. That's a threat that they're not happy with. But there's also the logistical nightmare that now comes with this. This is really the American fear. Look at a map of the Persian Gulf. There's a tiny narrow exit door at the bottom called the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 30% of the world's seaborne oil passes through that door every single day. If Iran controlled both sides of the Gulf, they could simply lock the door. They could freeze the economies of Europe, Japan, and the US overnight. And so the agenda that the US and Saudis come up with is ruthless. It's about containment. They realize that they can't invade Iran. It was too big and the mountains are too rugged. Instead, they have to basically bleed the revolution dry. They have to keep the Iranian military so busy fighting for its life that it wouldn't have the energy to topple any other governments. And the solution? They find themselves a contractor. Right next door was Saddam Hussein of Iraq. He was a secular dictator who hated the religious fanatics in Iran. So in a cynical move, the US and Saudi Arabia effectively back him to start a war. Saudi Arabia provide the cash, as they always do, billions of dollars, and the US provide the intel, the tech, the satellite imagery. They don't necessarily want Saddam Hussein to win. They just want Iran to lose. And for 8 brutal years, 1980 to 1988, it works. The war acted as a pressure valve, trapping the Iranian revolution inside its own borders and keeping the oil flowing through the strait. But once the war ended, the US realized something a little bit problematic. You can't just keep hiring local dictators to do your dirty work. Eventually, they might go rogue, which, as you might remember, Saddam Hussein did. He was a terrible person, and not somebody that you remember as a friend to the US, despite the fact that the US had backed him. So in 1990, the US make a decision to shift their strategies, and that kind of brings us to today. They stop hiring contractors and move themselves into the neighborhood. And this marks the shift we have all become familiar with: hundreds of thousands of US troops on the ground throughout the Middle East. Most people just leave it at that. They think the US intervention in the region is simply about America wanting the oil, but in truth, it's much more complicated. It's about the dollar. We have to understand that the US-Saudi relationship isn't just a military alliance. It is the engine room of the American economy. Back in 1974, this deal that was struck is still impacting us till this day. Yes, it was pure genius in its simplicity, but it's vital for the US global power. This is the way that the dollar stays strong. It's based on the Saudis. America's willingness to protect the royal family wasn't altruistic. It was based on them refunding and putting those billions of dollars back into the US Treasury. This is how the US runs massive deficits and doesn't crash its economy. The Saudis create, till this day, a constant global demand for that dollar, and they fund the US government's debt. So when the US sends troops to the Middle East, they aren't just protecting oil wells, they are protecting the value of the currency in your wallet. But over the last few years, the Saudis have realized that this protection part of the deal might be a lie, which is why a moment that happened in 2019 is kind of pretty crucial. In the early hours of the morning of September, a swarm of Iranian-made drones and cruise missiles slammed into Saudi Arabian oil processing facilities. It was a devastating precision strike that knocked out almost 50% of Saudi Arabia's oil production in minutes. The Saudis, remembering their deal, looked to the White House, expecting the full force of the US military to retaliate against Iran. After all, that was the deal. We give you the oil market and you give us protection. But the response was a little bit shocking. Trump basically said that the attack was unfortunate. It's an attack on Saudi Arabia and not the United States, and so we don't really want to intervene. He kind of hesitated. And ultimately, there was no proper American counterstrike. In that moment, the calculus in Saudi Arabia shifted. They realized that they were vulnerable and that their entire economic future, their Vision 2030, the trillion-dollar project to move away from oil dependency and build futuristic cities like Neom, was sitting in a glass house. You see, the Saudis understand that oil is becoming less and less important. Right now, of course, oil is very important. But with time, as green energy comes in, countries are going to need other things to fuel their economy. And the Saudis are banking on building a global tourism and tech hub. But if there are Iranian missiles raining down on your airports, tourism and tech isn't really going to develop. They realize that if the US wouldn't fight Iran, they need to appease Iran. And this is where things get a little bit dangerous. As we'd mentioned, Saudi Arabia and Iran were enemies, definitely ideologically, when Khomeini came in. But now the Saudis realize, wait a second, maybe being on the side of the West isn't exactly the smartest thing for us. Maybe we're better off brokering some sort of peace deal with Iran so that we're in safe territory. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran signed a deal to restore relations, but it wasn't brokered by the US. It was brokered by Beijing, China. The Saudis took out an insurance policy. They know Iran relies on China to buy a huge amount of its oil. By bringing Beijing in as the guarantor, the Saudis effectively ensured that if Iran attacks them, Iran is defying its own economic lifeline. But here's the catch. Note who they chose as their partner. The Saudis are quietly shifting directions. Whilst they had focused on the West and America as being their partner, they're now looking at the Chinese and the Iranians, which is something that the Americans notice. This is a bit problematic. Keep in mind, by the way, that the deal that Saudi Arabia has with Iran to protect its own location is with the current regime. If the US attacks and topples the Ayatollah, if there is a regime change, the Saudi-China deal becomes void. The Saudis look at the fall of the mullahs and they don't really see liberation for the Iranian people, who they couldn't care less about. They see chaos that would ruin their economy. So, ironically, the Saudis have become the primary defenders of the status quo in Iran. This is deeply worrying for the US. If the Saudis are now looking to China and Qatar for protection, they don't need the petrodollar deal anymore. If they start selling oil in yuan, the American economic superpower status is in real danger. But obviously, it gets more complicated. If you were to look at a map of the ideologies of the Middle East, the Saudis, although not Western, have traditionally been aligned with the UAE, Dubai. Both nations were the anti-Islamist bloc, and that was significant because they are a massive portion of the Middle East. They're the forward-thinking, modernizing autocracies that view groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas as threat to their rule. On the other side, you had Iran and Qatar. They were different. They were the patrons of political Islam. Qatar hosts the Muslim Brotherhood, Iran backs Hamas and Hezbollah. For decades, Saudi Arabia and the UAE were locked in a pro-stability alliance to keep the Islamist revolutionary axis at bay. But as of a few weeks ago, the architecture has shifted. A headline most of us missed has taught us a suspicious new direction for the Saudis, which, if you were looking, you may have started to notice back in 2023. They are suddenly starting to make enemies with their old friends in the UAE and cozying to Qatar. What about this? Well, reports surfaced of Saudis backing forces actually clashing with the UAE-backed separatists in southern Yemen. It wasn't just a skirmish, it's a symptom of a much, much deeper problem. The Saudis and the Emiratis are now bitter economic rivals, competing for the same foreign capital and regional status. The Saudis feel that the UAE is undercutting them, and to stabilize themselves as the superior force in the Middle East, they've decided that it's time to cut that relationship with the UAE. But it's not just the UAE that they are leaving. They are leaving the Western mentality by cozying to China, to Qatar, who can help them tremendously with funding if their 2030 project goes wrong. They are in many ways joining a side that is very problematic. It's also an indicator of a much more worrying track for the next few years, because the Saudis are worried that their financial overhaul isn't happening fast enough, and they are looking for new friends who can offer different things. This is where Qatar enters the picture. Qatar shares a massive gas field with Iran, and because of this geography, Qatar has always maintained a working relationship with Iran, acting as a bridge. By pivoting towards Qatar and away from the UAE, Saudi Arabia is effectively trying to buy safety. They are aligning with the Qatar-Iran axis, not because they like them ideologically, but because Qatar can mediate with Iran to keep their kingdom safe from attack. This is much, much, much more worrying for the US. I'm not saying if the Saudi and Qatar shift is the sole reason the US held back on attacking Iran. It looks like an insufficient answer on its own, but I will say this. This marks a very big shift in the geopolitics of the Middle East that, of course, then impacts the US. The Saudis are moving away from the American security umbrella and towards a regional integration model with their former enemies. And it's not being talked about enough. Keep in mind the fact that the Saudis made a deal with Iran that they would lose if the regime changes. They don't want this regime to change, even if it's terrible. It's another reason they aren't excited about this, even if it means that it's the downfall of their once ideological enemy. Ideologies get in the way when finances are being attacked. As always, the media is negligent, giving you pieces of the story but not connecting the bigger dots. You've probably seen about 100 articles about how the US should intervene in Iran, but bets are that part of the story has been missed from the narrative. Have you even heard of the petrodollar? Why talk about the main decision factor when we could focus on personality politics instead? Now, all of this is important, but it still doesn't explain why I, as an Israeli, am speaking about this. Have no fear. It all makes sense. You see, I'm interested in the question of where this leaves Israel. Because we have to look past the headlines. Whilst the media is focusing on whether a Saudi-Israel peace treaty is on or off, the real game is quietly happening underground. We know that public normalization is currently stuck. You can't be best friends with Israel whilst you're busy appeasing the Iranian regime. But Israel realized years ago that in this neighborhood, you cannot rely on diplomatic smiles or signed pieces of paper. You need leverage. You need to be essential. And this is where the strategy that we are currently seeing comes into play. Despite their leverage over the US, the Saudis still have a massive geographical vulnerability. Their entire economy relies on exporting oil. And right now, that oil is trapped between two dangerous choke points: the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf and the one in the Red Sea. Both are effectively controlled by Iran or its proxies. And if a war starts and those straits close, the Saudi economy stops. China can't fix that. Qatar can't fix that. But you've guessed correctly, Israel is the only one who can. For the last few years behind closed doors, and whilst we have been fighting on multiple fronts, Israel has been laying the groundwork to connect the Saudi pipeline network to the Israeli one. Remember, Israel has access to Europe. This infrastructure creates a secure route that bypasses the Iranian navy entirely, sending Saudi oil and AI and data directly to the Mediterranean and into Europe. This creates a new reality. The Saudis might pivot to China for political cover, but their physical economic lifeline to the West now runs through Israel. This is, by the way, how you build stability in the Middle East. Not through warm feelings and summits, but through cold, hard necessity. The Saudis don't have to love us. They just have to need us. And right now, Israel is positioning itself as the one asset that the kingdom cannot survive without. And honestly, the genius of it cannot be overstated. We hear Prime Minister Netanyahu making public statements about moving away from dependency on the US, and most people think he's just talking about ammunition shipments or the UN vetoes, but it is a bit deeper than just military aid. It's about realizing that the economic future of the world might just be located right here in the Middle East. And in that future, hedging your bets to be perceived as an indispensable friend rather than a charity case is the name of the game. And to think that this infrastructure strategy was being planned in advance during a multi-front war is just beyond me. While the IDF were fighting in Gaza and Lebanon, the strategists have been laying the groundwork for the next 50 years of economic dominance. This is pure genius. So where does this leave us now? In a complicated and uncertain new dynamic. We have to understand that Trump buddying up with Qatar and Saudi Arabia is more intentional than we had previously thought. Making an enemy of them isn't simple. Their decision impacts every American, whether Americans realize it or not. And if they're going to be moving towards more anti-Western ideologies, Americans should probably know that their top-notch weaponry is being sent to these people, like in the case with Iran. It's a bet. And unfortunately, it's one that isn't that unfamiliar to Americans. But quietly, Israel is hedging its bets too. We're moving away from being completely reliant on the West and the US as our sole defenders. Instead, we're building out our own long-term insurance policies for security, and we aren't the only ones. Look at the United States. Why do you think there is suddenly a decision to go after Venezuelan oil? Because Washington doesn't want the dependency on the shaky Gulf allies anymore either. It is all very up in the air, but these are exciting times. As we have said from the very beginning, the Middle East is the most interesting place in the world, and the lesson here is clear. We shouldn't be fighting to ask for favors. We shouldn't be begging for alliances. We should be setting the leverage to ensure that our potential enemies are actually dependent on us. And that is exactly what is happening. We are moving away from dependency on the US and into a relationship of semi-equals. The shekel is doing very well, and we are doing the same with the Saudis. We aren't asking them to like us. We're just making sure they can't live without us. And that kind of works to me. I'm Meira K, and I'll see you next time.